I changed the locks, Vanessa. My daughter, the successful CEO, finally gave back to the family that raised her. This new house is beautiful, isn't it? But you aren't coming inside. You see, I signed the deed in my name and Chloe's. You should be happy for your sister. After all, it was your company's money that paid for it. Now, get your bags off my driveway before I call the police. I stood there, staring at my mother on the balcony of the mansion my sweat and tears had funded. Beside her, my sister Chloe smirked, holding a glass of vintage wine from my own cellar. They thought they had finally outsmarted the workhorse of the family. They didn't realize that while they were busy stealing my house, I was busy making sure they'd never be able to afford the taxes on it. My name is Vanessa Parker, I am 32 years old, and this was the moment I realized my family was no longer my own. Before I tell you how I burned their stolen empire to the ground, please like and subscribe, but only if you believe that blood doesn't give anyone the right to rob you blind. And before we go back to the beginning, I always want to know where these stories are reaching people, so tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there right now. Now, let me take you back to the week it all started. It all started with a sourdough starter. That sounds small, almost domestic, but in my world it was everything. My grandmother brought that fermented jar of flour and water from the old country 60 years ago. It was a living thing, a bubbling, sour-smelling legacy that required feeding every single day. Growing up, my mother, Evelyn, treated it like a chore. My sister, Chloe, treated it like a mess. But to me, it was magic. By the time I was 25, I had turned that family heirloom into a small empire called Heritage Crust. I didn't just bake bread, I sold an experience of home. Within 5 years, I had 3 flagship locations in the city and a wholesale contract with every high-end grocery chain in the region. My life was measured in grams, temperatures, and early morning shifts. I was the first one in the kitchen at 4 in the morning and the last one to leave the office at 9 at night. While I was building, my family was consuming. My mother, Evelyn, had a taste for cashmere and coastal vacations that her social security check couldn't support. My older sister, Chloe, was a professional dreamer. She floated from one failed business idea to another: interior design, life coaching, organic candle making, all funded by loans from my personal savings. Loans that were never meant to be repaid. "We are a team, Vanessa," my mother would say whenever I hesitated to hand over another $10,000 check. "Family looks out for family. You have so much, and your sister just needs a little push." I believed her. I wanted to believe her. I was the successful one, the strong one, and I felt a heavy, silent guilt for having more than them. So, I shared. I put Chloe on the company payroll as a creative consultant, a job that involved her showing up twice a month to take photos for her social media. I bought my mother a new car when her old one broke down. I was the golden goose, and I thought that as long as I kept laying eggs, I would be loved. Then came Marcus. I met him when I was looking for a business consultant to help with my franchising expansion. He was sharp, handsome, and seemed to admire my work ethic. For 3 years, we were a power couple. He became my chief operating officer, the man who managed the contracts while I managed the craft. I trusted him with my passwords, my bank accounts, and eventually, a diamond ring. My mother and Chloe adored Marcus. They called him the son and brother they never had. Looking back, the signs were there. The way Marcus would whisper with Chloe in the kitchen when I entered the room. The way my mother started asking very specific questions about the company's intellectual property and the value of our proprietary fermentation process. "You should document everything, Vanessa," Marcus told me one night over dinner. "For the franchise disclosure documents. If something happens to you, the brand needs to survive." I thought he was being a responsible partner. I didn't realize he was building a manual for my replacement. At the time, I was distracted by a massive expansion deal. We were about to sign a contract with a national distributor that would put Heritage Crust in every major city in the country. It was a $20 million deal. I was exhausted, stressed, and leaning on Marcus more than ever. 6 months ago, my mother started talking about the house. She found a sprawling estate in the hills, a place with a 6-car garage and a view of the valley. It cost $4 million. "It for all of us," she whispered, clutching my hand. "A family compound. We can finally leave that cramped apartment behind. You, me, Chloe, and Marcus will be together." I told her it was too much. The expansion was eating all our liquid capital. I told her we had to wait. She cried for 3 days, accusing me of being cold and greedy. Chloe stopped speaking to me. Marcus played the mediator, telling me that maybe we could find a way to make it work if we leveraged some of the company assets. I stayed firm. I said no. I thought that was the end of it. But then, Marcus suggested I take a week off. I hadn't had a vacation in 3 years. He told me he would handle the final audit for the expansion deal. My mother suddenly became sweet again, urging me to go to a spa retreat upstate to reconnect with my spirit. I went. I spent 7 days in a robe, drinking green juice and trying to ignore the nagging feeling in my gut that something was wrong. I couldn't reach Marcus for the last 3 days of the trip. He said the reception at the office was bad due to a storm. When I drove back into the city, I didn't go to my apartment. I went straight to the new house, the one my mother had been obsessed with. I saw Marcus' car in the driveway. I saw Chloe's car. I saw a moving truck. I walked up to the front door, my key in hand, but the lock wouldn't turn. It didn't just stick, it was a different mechanism entirely. That was when my mother stepped out onto the balcony above, looking down at me not with love, but with a terrifying cold triumph. "Vanessa," she called out, her voice echoing off the stone walls. "You're just in time to see what a real family does for each other." I stood on that gravel driveway, my fingers trembling as I tried the key one last time. The metal scraped against the lock, a cold mechanical rejection. Above me, my mother smoothed her silk robe, a gift I had bought her for Christmas, and looked down as if I were a trespassing stranger. "Mother, what are you talking about?" I shouted, my voice cracking in the humid afternoon air. "Open the door. I have the down payment paperwork in my car. We haven't even finished the inspection on this place." Chloe stepped out beside her then. She was wearing a pair of my designer sunglasses, the ones that had gone missing from my dressing room 2 weeks ago. She leaned over the railing, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Oh, Vanessa," Chloe cooed, "always so literal. We didn't need your paperwork. Marcus helped us find a much faster way to close the deal. You're always complaining about how stressed you are running the company. So, we decided to take a little weight off your shoulders, permanently." The front door finally opened, but it wasn't to let me in. Marcus stepped out. He wasn't wearing his usual work suit. He was in a linen shirt and expensive loafers, looking like a man who had already retired. He didn't look me in the eye at first. He looked at the fountain in the center of the courtyard, then at his watch. "Vanessa, you should leave," Marcus said, his voice flat and professional. "The house is in Evelyn's name. The funds were transferred from the Heritage Crust corporate holding account yesterday morning. It was an authorized distribution." "Occupied?" I felt the world tilt. "I am the only one who can authorize a distribution of $4 million, Marcus. That's theft. That's embezzlement." He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't guilt, it was pity. "Check your emails, Vanessa, or better yet, check the updated operating agreement. While you were at that spa, the board, which consists of your mother, your sister, and myself, voted to remove you as managing member due to emotional instability and neglect of duties. You gave me power of attorney last year for the franchise filing, remember? I used it to ratify the change." I felt a coldness start at the base of my spine and crawl up to my throat. I hadn't been at a spa to relax. I had been sent there to be silenced while they gutted the house I had built. "You sold my company?" I whispered. "Not the company," Marcus corrected, stepping closer but staying behind the gate. "Just the intellectual property, the recipes, the name, the distribution contracts. A national conglomerate bought the rights for $18 million. After the house was paid for and the consulting fees were distributed to Chloe and your mother, there isn't much left in the accounts. In fact, Heritage Crust is currently sitting on about $2 million in unpaid vendor debt and back taxes. Since you are still technically the primary guarantor on those loans, well, I'd talk to a bankruptcy lawyer if I were you." I stared at the three of them. My mother, who I had fed. My sister, who I had clothed. My fiancé, who I had loved. They had formed a circle, and I was on the outside. "You stole the sourdough starter," I said. It was a strange thing to focus on, but it was the only thing that felt real. The jar. My grandmother jar. Chloe laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. "It in the kitchen, Vanessa." Marcus said the buyers need the original culture to synthesize the flavor for the mass production factories. "It turns out your magic is worth a lot of money when you sell it to people who actually know how to scale a business." "You can't," I said, my voice finally finding its edge. "You don't know how to keep it alive. If you don't feed it correctly, if the temperature isn't exact, it dies in 48 hours. It'll turn to gray sludge." "We have the manual you wrote, honey," my mother called out, waving a hand dismissively. "Don't be so dramatic. Now please, we have movers coming with the rest of Chloe things. You're blocking the path." She turned and walked back into the house. Chloe followed, blowing me a mocking kiss. Marcus stayed for a second longer. He looked at my old car, then back at the mansion. "It wasn't personal, Van," he said quietly. "You were just too slow. You wanted to build a legacy. We just wanted to be rich. You should have seen this coming. You're the one who taught me that business is about leverage." He shut the heavy oak door. I heard the bolt click. I sat in my car for a long time. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I watched the sun begin to set over the house that my money had bought, the house where my family was currently drinking my wine and celebrating my ruin. My phone started buzzing. It was an alert from my bank. My personal credit card had been canceled, then another. Then a notification that my access to the company's server had been revoked. They thought they had stripped me bare. They thought that by taking the name, the recipes, and the bank accounts, they had taken Vanessa Parker. But Marcus had made one very big mistake. He was a man of spreadsheets and contracts. He understood the value of a brand, but he didn't understand the science of the bread. And my mother? She had never read a contract in her life, she just signed where Marcus told her to. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I thought about the $4 million they had moved. I thought about the $18 million sale. And then I remembered the tax structure I had set up 3 years ago to protect the company from hostile takeovers. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, stay with me, because this was the moment I stopped being a daughter and started being a ghost. I leaned back in my seat and took a deep breath. I didn't need a key to get into that house. I just needed a phone. I didn't drive away immediately. I sat in the dark of my car, the glow of the dashboard the only light in the world. My mother and sister were probably opening a bottle of vintage champagne right now, toasted by Marcus' cleverness. But as an appraiser of reality, I knew something they didn't. Marcus was a brilliant chief operating officer, but he was a terrible tax strategist. He had spent so much time looking for a way to lock me out that he hadn't looked at the foundation of the house he was trying to steal. I pulled a weathered leather-bound notebook from my glove box. It wasn't the bakery manual, it was my personal ledger. For 3 years, I had been documenting every loan to Chloe and every expense my mother had submitted. I had kept these records not because I didn't trust them, but because I was a businesswoman, and I liked my books to balance. Now those books were a roadmap to their destruction. I called Julian Vance. Julian was more than a lawyer, he was a shark in a 3-piece suit who had helped me navigate the complex zoning laws of the city when I opened my first shop. He picked up on the 4th ring. Vanessa? It's 11 at night. Is everything all right? Julian, I said, my voice as cold and clear as mountain water. I need you to pull the corporate filing for Heritage Crust from 48 hours ago. Specifically, the ratification of the new board and the sale of the intellectual property to the conglomerate. I heard about the sale, Julian said, his tone shifting to professional concern. I thought you were finally taking that payout you deserved. I didn't authorize it. They used a restricted power of attorney in a fraudulent board meeting while I was out of the state. But that's not why I'm calling. Julian, do you remember the tax-deferred trust I set up for the Heritage brand? The one that holds the actual primary trademark and the specialized equipment leases? There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him typing. The one that requires a 2/3 majority of the original founding shareholders to dissolve or transfer. Exactly, I said, and who are the original founding shareholders, Julian? You, he whispered. And your grandmother estate, which you are the sole executor of. Your mother and Chloe were added as beneficiary observers, but they have 0 voting power over the trust assets. I felt a sharp, jagged spark of hope. Marcus sold the name and the recipes. But he didn't sell the trademark to the logo, and he certainly didn't sell the leases on the industrial ovens or the delivery trucks. He sold a shell, Julian. He sold a house with no floor. Vanessa, if they've already taken the $18 million from the buyer, and they can't deliver the trademark or the equipment, that's not just a breach of contract. That's a massive multi-million-dollar fraud against a national corporation. I know, I said, and there are more. The $4 million they used to buy that house. They took it from the corporate holding account. But that account was specifically earmarked for the federal tax withholding for the expansion. By taking that money, they didn't just rob me. They committed a felony against the Internal Revenue Service. As of 5 o'clock today, Heritage Crust is delinquent on nearly $4,200,000 in federal taxes. They've committed tax evasion in your name, Vanessa, Julian warned. You're the primary guarantor. No, I said, a small dangerous smile touching my lips. I checked the operating agreement before I left for the spa. Marcus updated the guarantor clause to include the acting managing member to satisfy the bank for the house loan. He wanted the power, so he took the liability. He signed his own name as the primary guarantor 3 days ago. He thought he was signing for a fortune. He was actually signing for a prison sentence. I spent the next 4 hours in a 24-hour diner, drinking black coffee and watching Julian upload documents to a secure server. We didn't just find the fraud, we found the blood. Marcus had been funneling small amounts of money to a private account for months. Not for my mother, but for himself and Chloe. He was playing both sides, promising my mother a mansion while planning to disappear with Chloe and the lion's share of the payout once the dust settled. I had the emails, I had the bank transfers, I had the fraudulent board minutes. But I needed one more thing. The novelty anchor. The sourdough starter. I knew that by morning they would realize they didn't know how to feed it. Without the exact ratio of filtered water and rye flour, and without the precise temperature of 72 degrees, the 60-year-old culture would begin to ferment into alcohol and then die. It was the heart of the business the conglomerate had bought. If the culture died, the deal was void, and the $18 million would have to be returned immediately. Money they had already spent on a house they couldn't afford to keep. Stay with me, because it only got worse for them from there. I realized that for years I had been the one keeping the fire going while they sat back and complained about the smoke. I had been the one who made sure everyone was fed, everyone was housed, and everyone was happy. I was done being the provider. I was ready to be the architect of the aftermath. I sent one final text to Marcus. I didn't threaten him. I didn't beg. I simply sent a screenshot of the tax-deferred trust agreement and the signature page where he had named himself the primary guarantor for the company debts. Then, I turned off my phone and drove to a small hotel near the airport. I slept for 8 hours, the best sleep I'd had in a decade. I knew that while I was dreaming, the gray sludge was already forming in that kitchen, and the walls of their stolen mansion were already beginning to close in. The confrontation didn't happen in the mansion. It happened in the one place they couldn't run from, the corporate headquarters of Heritage Crust, 3 days later. I arrived at 10 in the morning, dressed in my sharpest charcoal suit. I didn't use a key. I walked in with Julian and 2 representatives from the national conglomerate that had supposedly bought my soul for $18 million. The glass-walled conference room was already occupied. Marcus was there, looking haggard, his linen shirt wrinkled. My mother and Chloe were sitting on the plush leather chairs, surrounded by shopping bags from high-end boutiques. They looked like they were waiting for a celebration. Instead, they got a reckoning. "Vanessa," my mother gasped, standing up. "What are you doing here? We told you, you're no longer part of this company. Marcus, call security." "Security isn't coming, Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping an octave, echoing off the minimalist walls. "In fact, I suggest you sit down. We have a lot of paperwork to go through, and most of it involves the word prison." Marcus stood up, his face pale. "Van, listen, we can talk about this. The sale is final. The funds have cleared." "The funds cleared into a frozen account, Marcus," Julian said, stepping forward and dropping a heavy stack of documents onto the table. "My client, Miss Parker, has filed an emergency injunction. You sold intellectual property that was held in a restricted family trust. You didn't have the legal authority to transfer the trademark or the proprietary equipment leases. You sold a car without the engine, and you took $18 million for it." The lead representative from the conglomerate, a man named Mr. Henderson, leaned forward. His expression was made of flint. "Mr. Vance is correct. We've already started the clawback process. But that's the least of your worries. We were promised the original 6-decade-old starter culture as part of the quality control guarantee. We sent our lab technicians to the bakery this morning to collect it." He looked at Marcus, then at Chloe. "It dead. You left it in a stainless steel bowl at 85 degrees without feeding it for 72 hours. It gray, moldy sludge. You destroyed the primary asset of the acquisition." Chloe's face went from smug to terrified in 4 seconds. "It's just flour and water. We can just make more. Vanessa has the manual." "The manual doesn't create 60 years of bacterial complexity, Chloe," I said, walking slowly around the table. "That culture was our grandmother legacy. It was the only thing in this family that actually had a soul, and you let it rot because you were too busy picking out marble countertops for a house you don't own." "What do you mean we don't own it?" my mother shrieked. "The deed is in my name." "The deed was purchased with stolen corporate funds earmarked for federal taxes," I replied, leaning over the table until I was inches from her face. I could smell her expensive perfume, the one I had paid for. "Because Marcus signed himself as the primary guarantor for all corporate liabilities to secure that house loan, he is now personally responsible for the $4,200,000 in back taxes. And since the company accounts are now empty because of your consulting fees, the IRS is moving to seize the house as a primary asset of the fraud." Marcus collapsed back into his chair. He looked at Chloe, seeking some kind of support, but she was already moving her chair away from him, her eyes darting toward the door. "Vanessa, please," Marcus whispered. "I did it for us, for the future." "No," I said, "you did it because you thought I was weak. You thought that because I loved my family, I wouldn't protect my work. You thought I was the horse, and you were the rider. But you forgot that the horse knows the way home, and the rider is just a passenger." I pulled out one final document. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was a settlement agreement. "Here is how this goes," I said, my voice as sharp as a chef's knife. "Marcus, you will sign a full confession regarding the unauthorized transfer of funds and the fraudulent board meeting. In exchange, I will use my personal savings to settle the tax lien so you don't spend 10 years in a federal penitentiary. You'll still be barred from the financial industry for life, and you'll be bankrupt, but you'll be free. I turned to my mother and Chloe. As for the house, it being sold. Every penny will go back into the trust to rebuild the brand. You two will move back into the 2-bedroom apartment you started in. I've already paid the first 6 months of rent. After that, you are on your own. Chloe, you've wanted to be an entrepreneur for years, now is your chance. You can start from zero, just like I did. You can't do this to your own mother, Evelyn wailed, the tears finally starting the same manipulative tears I had fallen for 1,000 times. I'm not doing this to you, I said, standing tall. I'm stopping you from doing any more to me. You wanted the house, you wanted the money, you wanted the prestige. You got them for exactly 48 hours. I hope the view from the balcony was worth it. Vanessa, wait, Chloe begged, her voice high and panicked. What about the bakery? What about the brand? If the starter is dead, we have nothing. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small glass thermal jar. I set it on the table. Inside, a thick, creamy substance was bubbling with life. I didn't go to a spa, I said quietly. I knew Marcus was planning something the moment he suggested the trip. Before I left, I took a small sample of the original culture and kept it with me. I've been feeding it every 12 hours in my hotel room. This is the only piece of heritage crust that still exists. I looked at the conglomerate representative. Mr. Henderson, the $18 million deal is dead because of their fraud. But I am the sole owner of the trademark and the living culture. If you want to talk about a new partnership, one where I am the 100% owner and CEO, we can talk. But these 3 people are to be escorted out of this building immediately, and they are never to be allowed back in. The room went silent. Not a single person breathed. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of a siren on the street below. Get them out of here, Mr. Henderson said. Security arrived. They didn't be gentle. They took my mother by the arms as she screamed about ingratitude. They led Marcus out, his head bowed in total defeat. Chloe tried to grab one of her shopping bags, but a guard stepped in her way. That was bought with company funds, ma'am, he said. It stays here. As the door clicked shut behind them, I sat down in the head chair. My hands were finally still. I looked at the small jar on the table. It was bubbling. It was alive. And for the first time in 32 years, I was the only one who had the recipe for my own life. The silence that followed their departure was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It wasn't a heavy silence, though. It was light. It felt like the air in a room after a fever finally breaks. Mr. Henderson looked at me, then at the small glass jar on the table. You're a dangerous woman to underestimate, Vanessa, he said, his voice holding a new, genuine note of respect. Most people in your position would have burned the whole building down just to spite them. I didn't want to burn it down, I replied, my voice steady. I just wanted to own the ground it stood on. If I destroyed everything, I'd be just as destructive as they were. I prefer to build. We spent the next 3 hours drafting a new letter of intent. The $18 million deal was off the table, replaced by a much more sustainable partnership. I retained 51% of the company. I kept the trademark. I kept the soul of the brand. The conglomerate provided the logistics and the capital to scale, but I remained the final word on every loaf that left the ovens. 2 weeks later, I stood in the small apartment I had rented for my mother and Chloe. It was clean, functional, and miles away from the hills. I had dropped off a box of their personal belongings, things that actually belonged to them, not the company. You're a monster, Chloe hissed, her eyes red from crying. She was sitting on a cheap sofa, surrounded by boxes. You have millions, and you're leaving us here, in this cage? It's not a cage, Chloe, it's a beginning, I said, placing the last box on the floor. For 15 years, I paid for your mistakes. I paid for your dreams. I paid for your silence. I'm not doing it anymore. You have a college degree in 2 hands, use them. My mother wouldn't even look at me. She sat by the window staring at the street. After everything I sacrificed for you, she whispered. You didn't sacrifice for me, Mother. You invested in a version of me that you could control. When I stopped being controllable, you tried to liquidate me. That not love. That business. And as you've always said, we're a team. Well, the team has disbanded. I walked out the door and didn't look back. I didn't feel the surge of spiteful joy I thought I would. I just felt a profound sense of peace. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at a table that was designed to starve me. Now, I was perfectly happy eating alone. I moved to a small coastal town 300 miles away. I kept a small office there, managing the national expansion of Heritage Crust via video calls. But most mornings you can find me in a tiny nameless bakery I opened on the pier. It only sits 10 people. There is no signage, no branding, and no corporate strategy. There is only the smell of rising dough and the sound of the ocean. I still have the original starter. I feed it every morning at 5. It's thriving. It turns out that when you remove the toxins and the stress, even the oldest things can find a new way to grow. Sometimes, I get letters. Marcus sent one from the bankruptcy court, a long, rambling apology that I recycled without reading past the first paragraph. My mother sends texts every few months, usually asking for money for a medical emergency that Julian investigators quickly prove is a lie. I don't block them, I just don't answer. Their voices are like static on a radio station I no longer listen to. Healing isn't about forgiveness, not always. Sometimes, healing is just about setting a boundary so high that the people who hurt you can no longer see over it. It's about realizing that your value isn't measured by how much you can endure, but by how much you're willing to protect. I am Vanessa Parker. I am 32 years old. I am a baker, a CEO, and a survivor. But most importantly, I am finally the owner of my own name. If this story meant something to you, or if you have ever had to choose between your family and your future, leave your thoughts below. I read every comment, and I want to know that I'm not the only one who had to lose everything to finally find herself. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of truth and reclamation. Thank you for listening.